been a very long time since we've had a brand new Onimusha game, and now, more than 20 years after the last mainline release, Capcom is finally bringing the series back with Onimusha, Way of the Sword. The full game isn't actually out yet, so I want to make something clear right from the start. Everything I'm talking about in this review is based on the playable demo, and after finishing the demo, I was impressed. There are a lot of things we still don't know about the full game. I can't tell you how good the overall story will be, how much enemy variety we'll eventually see, how progression develops over 20 or 30 hours, or whether the combat remains satisfying through the entire experience. What I can tell you is that the roughly 40 minutes I spent with it left me wanting more, so let's talk about why.
They're smarter than we think.
Way of the Sword takes place in a twisted version of Edo period Kyoto, where the city has been consumed by a supernatural force known as Malice and overrun by the Genma. This time we're playing as Miyamoto Musashi, the legendary Japanese swordsman, although obviously this is a dark fantasy interpretation of the historical figure. Musashi ends up wielding the Oni Gauntlet, which gives him supernatural abilities and allows him to absorb the souls released by defeated enemies, and almost immediately, I think one thing becomes apparent. The combat is the star of this game. There's a weight to sword fighting here that I really enjoyed. Hits don't feel like you're simply shaving numbers off of a health bar. Swords collide, enemies react to being struck, attacks carry momentum, and successful defensive moves have a satisfying impact behind them. The sound design helps tremendously. When two blades meet, you hear it. When you land a heavy strike, you feel it. And when you successfully counter an attack that looked like it was about to take your head off, there's an immediate sense of satisfaction. I could tell the demo was being forgiven with me. There were times where it looked as though I was clearly within the enemy's hitbox, and it still somehow gave me the counter. You have both one-handed and two-handed attacks. The one-handed attacks are quicker, while the two-handed attacks sacrifice speed for considerably more force. During the demo, I found myself relying more heavily on faster attacks, but I can see the potential for the distinction to become more important as tougher enemies and different defensive situations are introduced later in the game. Simply attacking isn't really what makes the combat interesting, it's everything happening around those attacks. Enemies have both health and stamina, and attacking their stamina can eventually break their defenses and leave them vulnerable to devastating follow-ups. You can block, you can deflect, you can parry, and you can dodge. And importantly, those aren't all the different names for accomplishing exactly the same thing. A well-timed parry can redirect an enemy and potentially send them crashing into the environment. Perfectly timing an evasive move can give you an opportunity to immediately counterattack. Projectiles can be deflected, enemies can be knocked into objects, and there are moments where two weapons collide and you end up in these dramatic exchange of blades. The result is combat that feels surprisingly interactive. You're not simply waiting for an enemy attack so you can press the parry button and go back to your combo. You're watching what they're doing and deciding how you want to respond. Then there's Issen. Instead of safely blocking an incoming attack, you can immediately, before the enemy strike connects, and potentially land an extremely powerful counter. Instead of safely blocking an incoming attack, you can attack immediately before the enemy strike connects and potentially land an extremely powerful counter. It's inherently risky because you're deliberately allowing an attack to come dangerously close to hitting you, miss the timing, and you're probably going to pay for it. Get it right, and it's incredibly satisfying. And this is where I think Way of the Sword starts separating itself from just being another modern action game built around parrying, such as Bloodborne or possibly Sekiro. And surprisingly, the game also encourages you to be aggressive. Defeated enemies release souls that can be absorbed through the Oni Gauntlet, with different souls replenishing things like health or energy. So when you're hurting, the answer isn't necessarily to retreat to the opposite side of the arena and wait for an opening. Sometimes the best way to recover is to keep fighting. This seems to create a nice push and pull where the game rewards defensive precision while still encouraging you to stay engaged. The demo also throws multiple enemies at you surprisingly quick. The earliest Genma aren't particularly intimidating on their own, but things become much more interesting once different enemy types begin appearing together. You start dealing with larger enemies, armored opponents, ranged attackers, and enemies that aren't nearly as easy to stagger, and that's when positioning becomes much more important. Getting surrounded can be a problem. You can be focused on the enemy directly in front of you while somebody else is preparing an attack from outside your immediate view. Suddenly, you're not just thinking about your combo, you're thinking about where everybody is standing. Which enemy needs to die first? Can I push this guy into something? Do I need to deal with that ranged attacker first? Should I disengage or risk going for an Issen? The environment isn't completely passive either. There are objects you can use during fights, and enemies can sometimes be manipulated into environmental hazards or obstacles. It's not something I was constantly using, and quite frankly, I forgot to even try to use, but it adds another layer of possibility to encounters, and I'm interested to see how far Capcom takes it in the finished game. Then there's the boss fight. Without spoiling too much, this was probably where I became sold on the combat. Regular enemies teach you the mechanics, and the boss asks whether you were paying attention. Suddenly, the timing becomes considerably tighter. You have to read attacks. You have to know when you can be aggressive and when you're about to get punished for it. Dying didn't really frustrate me as much because I usually understood what I'd done wrong. That's a very important distinction in difficult action games. There's a difference between dying and thinking that was garbage and dying while immediately knowing, yeah, I screwed that up. And because you're able to get back into the action quickly, I found myself wanting another attempt rather than feeling like the game was wasting my time. Outside of combat, the demo gives us a much smaller glimpse of what the full game is actually going to be. The Oni Gauntlet plays a role in exploration and allows Musashi to perceive supernatural elements within the environment. There's some backtracking and light environmental progression, and the finished game is expected to remain in a primarily stage-based adventure rather than becoming a giant open world. Personally, I'm happy about that. Not every game needs a map filled with hundreds of icons. If Capcom can create carefully designed environments with worthwhile exploration, optional paths, side content, and hidden encounters, I'd much rather have that than an enormous open world simply for the sake of having one. The visual presentation also deserves some attention. The game looks fantastic. Kyoto has this combination of historical Japanese architecture and supernatural horror that gives the environment a very distinctive atmosphere. And the Genma themselves allow Capcom to get considerably stranger with the enemy designs than they could in a purely historical samurai game. Musashi himself is modeled after the legendary Japanese actor Toshiro Mifune, and it gives the character a fantastic presence. He kind of reminded me of the character from Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, though that is also potentially up for debate. He's not presented as some perfectly composed, emotionless hero either. There's personality here. His interactions with the Oni Gauntlet give us glimpses of that, although the demo obviously doesn't provide enough story for me to judge where that relationship or the larger narrative is ultimately going. That's where I have to draw the line with this review. It tells me that I like the combat, it tells me that I like the presentation, and tells me that I want to see more of the enemies, bosses, environments, and mechanics. What it cannot tell me is whether those systems have enough depth to remain interesting across the entire game. Maybe the full game continually introduces new weapons, enemies, and situations that force you to rethink how you fight. Maybe what feels fantastic after 40 minutes starts becoming repetitive after 15 hours. We simply don't know yet. But a demo really only needs to accomplish one thing, that is, make me want to play the finished game, and Way of the Sword did that. I enjoyed this more than I expected to. The sword fighting feels heavy without feeling sluggish. The defensive mechanics reward timing. The Issen system gives you a reason to take risks. The soul mechanics encourage aggression. And the encounters already show signs that fighting groups of enemies is going to require more thought than simply locking onto one target and hammering the attack button. There are some things I want to see improved or expanded upon. I'd like the distinction between different basic attacks to become more meaningful. I want to see more enemy variety. I want to know how character progression works across the full game, and most importantly, I want to see whether Capcom can maintain this quality once we're outside the carefully selected portion represented by the demo. But based on what I've played so far, Onimusha Way of the Sword is going on my wish list. I'm not going to tell you to buy a game that isn't out yet based on 40 minutes of gameplay, but I absolutely recommend downloading the demo and trying it for yourself. There's one final thing worth mentioning about the release. You will see a lot of videos and articles saying that Onimusha Way of the Sword releases on September 25th, 2026. That information was correct, but it isn't anymore. At the time I'm recording this, Capcom has officially moved the release date forward, and the game is now scheduled to launch on September 4th of 2026. So we're actually getting it about 3 weeks earlier than originally expected. After playing this demo, I'm perfectly fine with that. For now, I can't give Onimusha Way of the Sword a final score, but as a first impression, this is exactly what I wanted a demo to do. It showed me enough to understand what Capcom is trying to build without showing me enough to satisfy my curiosity. That's probably the strongest recommendation I can give it right now. If you've played the demo yourself, let me know what you thought about the combat and whether it convinced you to add the game to your wish list. And if you enjoy reviews focused on whether games are actually worth your time and money, consider subscribing for more. Regardless of that, thank you very much for watching. Until next time.